All right, we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Thank you all for coming out, especially Aditya on 3 hours of sleep posting your care deadline. I honestly was expecting, yeah, I was honestly expecting we might have a bit of a sparser attendance today because of that, but it's a great show. Thanks for coming out, everybody. So yeah, today for our visiting BVCS speaker, we're very fortunate to have Adrien Bousseau. Adrien is a researcher at Inria. Since I think not everybody here knows what that means, Inria is a French federal research institution. They have locations around the country. Adrien is at the Sophia Antipolis location, which is just outside of Nice in the south of France, which is a very pleasant place to be, as I discovered when I visited them a little over a year ago. Adrien and I have a joint grant that's funded by the NSF and the ANR, which is sort of French analog to NSF, on converting sketches into parametric CAD models that Yombo has been helping us out on a lot. Actually, yesterday at lunch, Adrien reminded me that our connection goes back a little further than that, which is that when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, we overlapped for 1 year when you were doing your postdoc with Manish Agrawala and Ravi Ramamurthy at the time. Just a fun story to hear. I am used to interacting a lot with students and constantly feeling like I am very old. So it's nice to hear. Made me feel like I was a little bit young for once. So Adrien has done lots of super cool work over the years in image manipulation, image creation, everything from photographic editing and relighting to vector graphics to a lot of stuff on sketch-based modeling, which is sort of where we overlap. And more recently on this idea of computational circular design, or broadly speaking, like sustainable computational design for sustainability, which I don't know that much about. And so I'm really excited to hear about it. So let's everyone give Adrien a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Indeed, no sketches in that talk, which makes me a bit nervous. Topic for a decade. Yeah. And actually, this whole new direction of circular design is also new to me. So it makes me a bit nervous, but just to say that what I will present today is the result of very recent research, so it's preliminary results. Take them as is. That's also why I'm excited to share them, because I hope it will stimulate some discussion and inspiration. So what I mean by circular design is actually in opposition to the standard linear production pipeline, where typically manufacturing a product starts with raw materials, being wood or metal or plastic. Those materials get transformed and processed to create parts. Those parts get assembled, give a product that can be used, and ultimately is thrown away. And that's where waste happens. That every step of that pipeline adds value to the product, but if the product is thrown away, this entire value is lost. So the goal of circular design is to create loops to bring back or to actually preserve resources in this production pipeline. So one obvious way is through repair. So you change or fix a part, and this way you don't have to throw your entire object away. This can extend the lifetime of products, but it's limited to the same product. So if your product is in good shape, but it's just not useful anymore, it's obsolete, then repair won't change that state, and the entire product is wasted again. Another extreme is recycling, where the product is actually completely decomposed and materials are recovered. And once you have raw materials again, you can process them again and create new parts and so on. But in circular design, recycling is actually often seen as the last resort. It's better than throwing away, but it's not so much better because many materials lose quality as you recycle. And as you see on this arrow, you really go back to the very first step. So you lose all the value you have accumulated as you created your product. So a product has some embedded value and it's lost when you recycle. And even more importantly, some materials are just very hard to recycle. And that will be the focus of my talk. Objects like wind turbine blades are made of composite materials. So it's a complex combination of glass fibers and resin and balsa wood that are very hard to separate. And as a result, currently the mainstream end-of-life for wind turbine blades is to be landfilled sometimes, but most often incinerated. So those very complex, lightweight materials are really lost. And just to give some numbers, there's a study that suggests that by 2050, the cumulated waste of wind turbine blades will reach 40 million tons. So that's really a lot of material. It's not necessarily because the blades are degraded. It's just that after 30 years, the new generation of wind turbines are more efficient. So they are replaced, but those blades cannot be reused for anything else. The other type of objects we look at are garments. This number is also quite scary. Around 30% of garments are actually never sold because they are mass produced, but maybe due to change of fashion or fit or anything, the consumers don't buy them. And out of all of those garments, even if they get sold, often they are thrown away before being unusable, just because again people change taste and they don't renew their garments. And with current technology, only a very small fraction of virgin fibers can be recovered from garments. So here are just two extreme examples, but they are also quite compelling from a computer design point of view, because there's been quite some work on fashion design and so on. And so that's the two domains on which I will focus on. So an alternative to those two extremes I presented is what I will call reuse or structural reuse, which is a term used by one of my collaborators. But the idea is to use parts of existing objects to create new parts for new objects. So for instance, use parts of a wind turbine blade to do a completely different object. And so the main benefit is to preserve as much as possible the quality of those high-grade materials, but still have the freedom to go outside of the original domain and create new types of shapes. And so there are already some real-world examples. So here are different designs created by several design studios. So a playground, a bus shelter, out of pieces of wind turbine blades. And for fashion, there are many examples on reusing existing garments to create different ones. So those will be our motivated examples for the different projects I will present. But this made me wonder, okay, if we target this reuse scenario, how would be the toolbox for that? And actually, this made me realize that existing CAD softwares were not designed for this type of reuse. I would claim that actually CAD tools were really designed for the linear way of production. Many CAD operations directly map to material processing. So for instance, an extrusion or a fillet can be implemented with metal sheet bending or milling, where raw materials are processed. But for the reuse scenarios that I presented, those type of operations are not so helpful. We talk more about cutting and reassembling. So I'm not the first one to consider that problem, and notably in architecture and structural engineering, different groups have explored how to reuse existing structures to create new structures. So there's a group at EPFL led by Quentin Fivet, who looked at truss structures. So in this slide, the top row is, let's say, a target design that the designer would like to create. And the two bottom rows show two solutions obtained with different available stock. So the algorithm will adjust the design such that it can support the load that the structural engineer wanted to achieve, but using the beams that are available in the existing truss structure. And similar work has been conducted at MIT by Kathleen Müller and colleagues, where again they start with an existing stock, an inventory, and with some matching algorithm, they can try to best approximate a target structure. And they also did a work I like a lot, which is going beyond beams with tree trunks and tree forks. They observed that in trees, usually the straight branches are used to create some timber elements, but the forks are often thrown away, while they are the very strong parts of the tree because they support the actual structure. And so they reuse the forks to create a structure shown on the right. So this is just to say that indeed this idea of design through reuse has been explored already, but to my knowledge, mostly for linear structures like beams and forks are best. So we were curious about whether we could apply similar principles to surfaces. And that will be the goal of my presentation. I will present 3 recent projects we've done on reusing surfaces for wind turbine blades and also for garments. And so the first project will actually be presented next week at SCF. It's a collaboration with ESA Pöpping and Ageli Lustra from TU Delft, who are working at the Industrial Design Department on circular design. Mariana Popescu, who was at TU Delft when we started, but she recently moved to MIT. And Marcia Russo, who is a postdoc in the group. And actually, I will give the floor to Marcia, since this way she can practice for talk for SCF. Yes.
Thank you. So this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler where it's going to be around this SCF next week. And so as Adrien said, we were basically focusing on trying to reuse this kind of materials. So starting from blades, especially, but the same thing also applies to planes, fuselage, and wings. So what is actually problematic about these kind of materials that they're made of different components? So it's like glass fibers, but they also have other kinds of glues and these kind of things. So it makes reuse very, very complex. And the other problem is that they are incredibly big. So it is even like harder to actually cut those things in an easy way. And just to give a scale of how big they are, this is like a standard graph representing the height of wind turbines in general. And as you can see, it increases throughout the years. So now it's like the biggest examples could have been big as the, I suppose, the Freedom Tower in New York or something like that, but still the Eiffel Tower is pretty high. So this is for a scale. And another representation we have, this is basically taking the horizontal section of the blade. So as you can see, for a scale, the person that are actually working on that, you can see how big they are. And this also, of course, makes everything really, really hard to recycle. There has been work on this specific part of materials, also performed by one of our co-authors. And as you can see here, they were focusing on the smaller blades, and they were trying to reuse the flat parts only. And as you can see here, they managed pretty well to actually reduce them, but the point is that they only could reduce the 55% of the material instead, because they were only focusing on like flat parts. But these kind of materials also have really nice curvature. So what about them? What could happen to them? So instead of like putting them in a land to work as a trash, we could actually think about reusing them, taking inspiration from what's already existing as a structure. So freeform architectures or even sport equipments, which have really nice and smooth characteristics. And in the sport equipment scenario, we mainly focused on pump truck modules. So for those who are not into pump trucks, I was not at the beginning of this project, but now I see pump trucks everywhere. Those are basically trucks that are made of like up and down rollers. And you do actual movement, an actual pump movement on a bike to increase your speed, and you roll over it with nice turns and ups and downs. So some of them are actually built on top of the ground. Some other ones are just made of a collection of pre-built modules you can just put on the ground to create these kind of like rollers. And so part of the work that is being done by the TU Delft group was actually to see how feasible was it to reuse this kind of materials to create one of those modules. So they acquired these decommissioned wind turbines, and their goal was to identify panels which had a similar curvature to pre-existing modules that they had access to. And the other goal was how to define cuts and how to assemble those modules to have a seamless path that was actually going well with the pre-built modules. And they actually built the track itself, and they also had a test study, let's say there with people like actually doing the roller movements on these two trucks. And here, the first part of the truck is actually made of pre-built module, and just the very last segment, which has this greenish color, is the one that has been plugged in by reusing wind turbine blades. And but the problem with that is that they had to do everything manually, which this was actually involving a lot of trial and error and measurements. So this is where our part of the project started. So we tried to mimic kind of the same approach in an automatic way to simplify this this trial and error process. So we starting from a virtual model of a blade, we cut it into 1.5 meter segments, and we divided each segment of a blade with into 4 different panels according to the horizontal line and the star cap reference plane you can see there. And those are basically the same input I had in the actual real life application. And our goal here was actually to select pair of cuts that maximizes the number of compatible boundaries. So starting from a panel, we wanted to create these domino-like pieces we could glue together to create a final design. And yeah, this is the actual process that's being simplified. So chaining those modules with color-coded boundary according to compatibility could actually help in creating different variations of trucks. And the first goal was, the first idea was how we actually parameterize the cuts. So we used the distance and the angle with reference to this car cup plane, which basically is a beam in the middle of the blade. And we discretize this space, the search space in these cuts by assigning a binary value to each of these candidate cuts in our optimization process. So we actually solve an assignment problem trying to select the best 2 cuts in this discrete search space that maximizes for this compatibility. So basically, we take every pair of panel and a cut on each of those panels, and we try to find the ones that maximize this function. And if they were selected together, it means that they have also a good compatibility score. So we want to maximize this function in our assignment problem. And in the end, what happened is that
If you go back to the previous slide, how do you come up with a discrete set of possible cuts? It seems like there's kind of a continuous space of possible cuts.
We just discretized the space, meaning that those cuts here, okay, they were placed at every 0.5 meters along the blade, and then we used 5 different rotation angles to create a little bit of variations. We actually needed to identify good rotations because we didn't want the cuts to be super weird, and we didn't want them to actually do not cut the panel from side to side, because you could also cut here in the very base, but was not creating interesting shapes.
Another question.
Yeah.
The compatibility scores is just based on length, or is there an aspect of curvature that you're also taking into account?
No, we're taking into account both position and curvature information. So the actual compatibility score is it's not complex, but it's tricky to explain here. But we account for both information to make sure the junction is right, and also there are no jumps in curvature that could prevent people from actually rolling on top of these rollers. And so in the end, exactly, we started from these blade sections to extract those kind of optimized modules. But the point now is that how do we identify which module have compatible boundaries? We know that it's a maximal set of compatibility, but which matches well with which. And to define that, we actually built a graph of these module boundaries. So each node in the graph is a boundary, and each connection encodes the compatibility between two different boundaries. And we run a Brown-Hairbush algorithm to extract the fully connected subgraphs, the maximal ones, with a little trick to update clusters when we have dangling nodes that were not assigned to each of those clusters, and so that we could actually color for the boundary to help people and artists to actually create those kind of trucks. And so starting from a little subset of panels extracted by I think 6 sections, we could actually create different variations. So here, if we stick the ones we highlighted in the slides, we could get this roller with 2 different heights, ups and downs. But if you also use other panels, you could actually get really nice twists and turns, which are frequently using like purpose. And so for future work, yeah, exactly. What happens here is that everything was still done manually. So the stitching part was done manually by users, but what could be really interesting to get is how to actually optimize for which plugins could be used to create the desired track. So possibly our artist or user could design a track, and there would be a complementary optimization algorithm that actually selects for the better modules in a module library we extracted with the algorithm before. And one other possible idea would be to apply this kind of same approach, but not just in single one-dimensional in 2 dimensions, to actually part this reuse to structural surfaces. So something that has been a proof of concept in our work was to build this bus shelter out of sequences of those panels. But it could also take inspiration from real existing structures like this curved structure that makes the roof of the Arnhem Central Station. So this is an inspiration for future work to actually port kind of the same idea to in a 2D like scenario. And I think my part would be over. Okay, so I give back the floor to Adrien.
And so you need to transition to this second project.
Can I ask a question for that work?
Sure.
Yeah. So just so you showed that out of your selected set of pieces, you had these 2 different type variations that you had. You had the notion of a maximal set of tracks that you can, like maximizing the number of different configurations that you can achieve.
We actually didn't think about it, I think, but it could be interesting. We were mainly like interested in how varied they could be, in the sense that we didn't only want it to be a straight line.
Yeah.
So cutting in a diagonal way also allows you to have these kind of curves, and we wanted to see whether the curve was actually smooth enough or not, but we didn't actually think about which are possible scenarios we wanted to get. Those mostly cover like how these kind of contracts are structured in real life. So they have these roller modules and they turn, and we wanted to make sure we could actually do both of them in a kind of reliable way. Yeah, no fun.
So to transition to the second project, like in what Marta presented, it was long tracks, but we didn't yet expand to 2D surfaces. And so that's what we explored in this other project with Adrien Bousseau, with Sergio Group, and David Gomez, with a collaborator, expert in geometry processing. So in that project, we try to maybe be more general than focusing on wind turbine blades. We just ask ourselves, okay, if we have any target shape and we have a stock of existing shapes, can we reproduce the target by cutting pieces from the source? And really, the core problem we were trying to formulate and solve is that we need to jointly decide where to cut the source and how to transform and assemble the panels we obtain to reproduce the targets. So it's a joint problem between segmentation and transformation. And in this example, because we didn't have a wind turbine blade in the lab, it was easier to buy some cold bottles. So we did some small scale prototyping using bottles as our source material. So it's a problem of shape approximation, which has been well explored in computer graphics, but most prior work focused on shapes that have some nice mathematical properties. So being planar or developable. On the right, it's more about how you can contract the shape to induce curvature. But in all those cases, you can actually rely on those mathematical definitions within the algorithm. While in our case, we are giving existing shapes, we know their geometry, but not to the point of having such nice mathematical properties. So that's why actually what inspired us most was not necessarily this family of work, but rather prior work on shape matching, and in particular partial shape matching, because they face the same problem of relating parts of a shape to another one. And in particular, this example was a strong inspiration because they formulated the problem as a succession of first defining lots of local descriptors on the shape, then matching those local descriptors together, and finally selecting a subset that covers well the target. And that was achieved through a graph cut optimization. And so our pipeline follows similar step. We start from local shape descriptors on our source and targets. We have a matching of those descriptors. This gives us a dense set of little patches over the shape, but too many of them and quite small. So the last step is to select a subset, expand them to obtain a good coverage. So the actual steps are very similar to this prior work, but we needed to adapt them to the specifics of our problem, and that's what I will detail now. So starting with the shape descriptor, a lot of prior work aims at matching deformable shapes. So they cared about intrinsic geometry, because this way they could be robust to bending of the surface. We're in a different scenario. We deal with rigid objects, so we wanted a descriptor that is extrinsic, which cares about whether the surface is bends or not. So just to illustrate the difference, here in this very simple scenario, we have a source which is the cylinder. We clicked on a point, and we want to find the best matches on this rounded cube. If we use the heat kernel signature on the left, which is an intrinsic descriptor, then the descriptor gives almost the same answer for the flat part of the cube or the rounded cube, because both areas are equally developable, same as the cylinder. While our intrinsic descriptor really fires on the rounded edge because this is the part that is cylindrical. So just to illustrate that the choice of descriptor was quite important in this project, and in practice, the descriptor we implemented is based on a family of work called integral invariance, where for a point on the surface, we take a series of spheres of increasing radius, and we intersect those spheres with the surface, and the length of the curves we obtain is a descriptor of the local curvature. And it's invariant to rigid transformation, but if we deform the surface, the descriptor will give a different answer. The reason why we chose this descriptor is that it also has other good properties in the sense that it's multi-scale and it's also localized. We really have a precise definition of the extent of that descriptor, and that will also be helpful for us. In particular, we exploited that for fast registration because we can use the arc length parameterization of the boundary of this curve on the surface to test every possible alignment between two patches from the two different surfaces. And this way, we don't have to do interactive closest points. We already know what points to compare. And that was quite important to obtain a fast registration algorithm. So then once we have good matches, keep in mind that they were based on this little disk neighborhood. But actually, once we have a good match, oftentimes the surface can actually register well on a much larger area. So this is illustrated with this purple area where this is where the two surfaces match well, even though they were registered based only on the little disk. So to expand those patches and really maximize their coverage, we solved this graph cut problem where basically every candidate patch is a label, and for every vertex of the target, we try to select the best candidate with a first term, which is how well it approximates the surface. The second term is a standard smoothness term in graph cut that tries to make the region compact. And the last term is trying to use as few labels as possible. So we are trying to minimize the number of panels in our reconstruction because that makes the fabrication easier. If we have many small, tiny pieces, it's harder to assemble than just a few large panels. So again, this is quite standard machinery, but it needed to be adjusted to our context. And so once we have the solver giving us those portions, we wanted to prototype the full pipeline. So we took some Coke bottles. The trick we found to actually map the segmentation onto the surface was to first unwrap the solution, print the cutting plan, and wrap it back on the bottle, and this way we could cut around it. So it's a bit approximate, but that was enough for proof of concept. And then we printed some custom connectors to stitch those pieces together. And so this is a video of the reconstruction we obtained. So one drawback of those Coke bottles is that they are transparent, so it's a bit hard to perceive. But luckily they are shiny. So look at the highlights, they suggest the curvature. So as I mentioned, it's approximate, it's a bit fragile, but I was very happy when I first saw that we could build these doubly curved surfaces from Coke bottles. And again, one argument would be that we only had to 3D print those little connectors. Well, if you had to 3D print this full object, it would be much more materials being used, while here at least we use large parts of those bottles. And just to continue on this proof of concept, we also try to manufacture this architectural surface. And overall, we do capture the overall shape of that target. We also made some other examples. On the top are different architectural surfaces. The bottom is turning an airplane into a car. So I'm not claiming that this is a practical scenario for the industry, but just to show that at least we could match parts well enough that you recognize the objects after reconstruction. But this also points to the remaining challenges of this line of work, which is first on the source side. In our algorithm, we don't measure whether the same part is reused multiple times, and so we might need several copies of the source to beat the target. So when dealing with Coke bottles, we actually exploited rotational symmetry because this allowed us to translate the panel around and try to pack as many panels as we could on a single bottle. But I think this suggests a challenging problem in general. Packing has been studied a lot on planar domains, but how to do packing on curved surfaces is not so obvious, especially if you want to consider slight deformations of your panel. It brings a new trade-off in your design space, which is, can I maybe trade a bit of the approximation quality if I gain on waste and can pack more panels on my source? And the other challenge is how to ensure that the panels can connect well on the target. Again, we didn't consider that in our formulation. Actually, our formulation does the opposite. It really focuses on what's happening inside the patches, but it doesn't check whether they connect. And in the worst case, we might actually have a gap which is as big as twice the tolerance we fix inside the patches. So that's actually what we're working on right now. It's how to model this continuity to ensure that the result is at least C0 continuous and even better. So this concludes this second project. I can answer quickly some questions if you have.
During one family vacation, my little brother asked my father to cut open a Fanta bottle, and he took the cutter and just tried to cut it, and then just sliced all over his hand. There was a lot of blood involved. I'm saying this because it makes me think that cutting surfaces is much harder than cutting planners, just planar surfaces. How did you do that, and how do you think what are more what are better cutting manufacturing processes for that?
Yeah. So luckily there was no grad students involved in this process, but we went quite some time prototyping different solutions. This wrapping solution is maybe not ideal. Actually, in a related work I've seen on using orange skin to do shapes, they had the idea of tracing with a marker some ISO lines of your pattern, and then like a grid, and then trace your pattern, like use this mapping to trace and cut. But indeed, here for Coke bottle, it was a proof of concept, but for larger objects like wind turbine blades, I will mention it a bit in my conclusion, but there are robotic arms that can use a water jet and cut precisely. At UDEL, they use the CNC water jets to do those cuts. If your blade is almost planar, you can use the CNC. But that was quite involved. I know that they actually went through a specialized company that has a CNC water jet, but because the blade is not flat, an operator needed to adjust the height of the water jets as it was cutting, which is quite an involved process. So with sensors, it could be automated, but right now this full pipeline doesn't exist. It's part of the challenge of what I'm presenting today, that we are focusing on the algorithm, but there's an entire industrial process that needs to be defined from acquisition to cutting, and security plays a role. Yeah, so it's not a short answer, but they are definitely also challenging on that part. All right, and actually the challenge you mentioned also appeared in this last project about garment reuse. So this was a collaboration with, so Adrien Bousseau is a postdoc in our group, Nico Pietroni from the University of Technology in Sydney, Maria Porosteleva and Olga Sortin-Organ at ETH Zurich. So we switch context from wind turbine blade, now we focus on garments, but as I mentioned in the introduction, it is an equally wasteful industry. So this diagram shows that starting from the fibers that are made from cotton or others, there's already a lot of waste in manufacturing garments. Like almost 20% of the raw material is wasted just because garments are made of non-squared panels. So even though you pack them as best as you can, cutting them from rectangular fabric generates some waste already. And once the product is sold, there's also 30% of garments that don't get sold, but if they are sold, often they are not used for so long, and they, in large parts, end up in landfills or incinerated. A very small portion of garments get really reused or recycled. So this is a motivation for recent work in computer graphics and HCI. Here I mentioned some very recent papers that share the same motivation. So actually the zero waste, Adriana was involved in that paper where by smartly designing the cutting pattern, you can actually avoid the 20% waste I mentioned at the beginning. All the fabric is used. On the right, it's using modularity to create garments that share similar modules. In that case, mostly those squares. And this way, either you can easily repair by replacing just one module, or you can reconfigure those modules to create different garments. So what's shown here is a different strategy to the one we explored, but I think it's complementary, and I will come back to that at the end. So what we focused on rather is, if I'm given an existing garment, I don't have any control on how it's designed, what can I do with it? And that's also been explored a lot, either in the fashion industry or by hobbyists who describe how they customize or change existing garments into new ones. So on the left is a reference book we studied. On the right are some of the tutorials we watched to gain insights about how people perform those reuse. And so we identified a few principles that guided the design of our algorithm. So one key principle is that different parts of the garment might have different value. In particular, the seams and hems are very costly to manufacture, but they're also difficult to disassemble and redo. So as much as possible, the designers try to reuse those variable elements in their new design. So that's shown on the left, where the seams of the pairs of jeans reappear as what is called princess lines on the top. Or the hems of the legs are reused as hems for the top. But to reuse those variable components, designers might have to deviate from their envisioned design. So even though they might start with an idealized top in this case, they have to adapt to whatever material they have. And that's also something we need to account for in our algorithm. And finally, one aspect that became helpful for us is that fabric has some favored orientation, the grain, and it's better to preserve this orientation. So when people cut those garments into pieces, they try to avoid rotating the pieces. They try to keep their original rotation, which actually reduces the search space, so it's good news for us. So concretely, the way we formulated the problem was we assumed that we're given the patterns as inputs, which we think is plausible because nowadays many garments are just created on software, those patterns exist somewhere, and there are also more and more reverse engineering algorithms that can take an existing garment geometry or even picture and recover the original pattern. So we assume that the pattern is given. We have what we call a source and a target. The goal is to find where to place the target panels on the source so that we can cut them from the existing garments while maximizing the reuse of seams and hems because those have quite some value. We tolerate some deformations of the panels to adapt to whatever stock we are given, but we like to minimize those deformations. So in this example of this little dog coat made of a pullover, we used this seam between the green and yellow panels that were on the original garments. We reused also a seam between the pink and beige. So basically in this presentation, when you see those little red dots with a number, it's just to highlight which parts were reused in the final target. So from a computational point of view, the main challenge is that some of those parameters are continuous, like the placement of the panels, we could place them freely over the existing garments, or the deformation can also be continuous, but some decisions are discrete, whether we reuse a seam or not. So that's actually a theme you might have seen in 2 previous projects. We often face those combinations of discrete and continuous unknowns, and we have to deal with that. So in this project, our solution was to discretize everything, a bit like what Marcia did in the previous one. So in the case of garments, our discretization was what are called polyominoes. So it's an approximation that makes the shape made of little squares, like Tetris pieces. And that allows us to treat the domain as this very regular grid, and our search space becomes just a sliding window because we can try every position over this grid. It's a finite number of positions and we can pick the best one. But still, we wanted to account for how much deformation is involved in this process, but that we can encode as a vector field. So our final representation is a grid with a little vector stored on every vertex, and that allows us to compare different panels and check that they don't deform too much when we match one to the other. And so concretely, we can now perform a sliding window search to try every possible candidates of the target panels over the source. And then we again solve an assignment problem. So that's my hammer on those problems. So the first term is comparing the deformation fields of the 2 polyominoes to try to, even if they deform the same way, then it's a good match. The second term measures some fabrication cost. So it's to model the fact that, for instance, cutting a seam is more expensive than cutting in the middle of a panel. But cutting a hem is free because it's already a boundary. While sewing a seam or a hem is expensive because you need to deconstruct them and resew them, while sewing something that was cut inside the panel is cheaper. So those costs, we fix them by hand. It might be adapted to the different type of fabric or tools you have, but it was just a way to model that part. And finally, the most important part is actually modeling whether we reuse seams. And that requires a pairwise term because we need to check if 2 panels on the source end up being neighbors on the target. And that made the full optimization much more costly because when you have those pairwise terms, it's quickly a mess. So just to comment on timings, for the garments we consider, which have a reasonable number of panels, like between 3 to 4 and maybe 10 or 12 the maximum, it took between a few minutes to up to half an hour to solve our problem, knowing that we adopted a multi-scale strategy to accelerate it a bit. So this remains a costly procedure, but then it allows us to solve for those different reuse scenarios. So there are a few examples from a dress to a top, a pair of pants to a bag, because it's not limited to garments, it can be fashion accessories. And every time I highlight the different seams we could reuse thanks to our optimization. So to get a sense of whether that makes sense, we also asked a fashion designer to redo the task we did, like we gave them the source and target and asked them to find a fabrication plan to achieve the results. So we are not using that really as a way to quantitatively compare the two. It's more to see if they adopt similar strategies. And indeed, they used a sliding window approach to basically slide the panels and see where they fit best. But they commented that it was very hard for them to envision whether deforming the panels could help, because that's not the way they are used to think about German design. So in that sense, our algorithm explores maybe a larger design space than what the designers tried to do, because it was a bit difficult for them to envision deformations. Which brings me to one of the trade-offs that the algorithm offers, which is how much we favor reuse versus deformation. So on the extreme left, if we really minimize deformations of the panels, we obtain a reconstruction which is very close to the target, but we could only reuse one small seam. While on the far right, we have lots of reuse of the different seams, but the results doesn't resemble so much the original shape. So this is just to show that, yeah, the algorithm offers some control to the user. The optimization also supports user intervention, for instance, to force some parts to be reused, or on the opposite, to prevent other parts to be used if it's a bit damaged, where we can exclude it from the search space. And finally, we also made a real-world prototype. So we hired a tailor, asked her to create 2 copies of this top. And once it was done, they went, now we should destroy one of them by cutting and reassembling. But it was just to prove that it can be done, but also one feedback she gave was that it's difficult to cut on a final product. She was used to cut flat panels, but cutting on a garment that is assembled on the body might be a bit more difficult. All right, and in terms of future work, well, we face similar challenges. For instance, the packing that I mentioned for the previous projects appears here as well. Sure, we reuse parts of the panels, but as a result, the leftovers have very awkward shapes, so it's even harder to reuse them. So ideally, taking some zero waste principles into account in the algorithm could help here. And also, I mentioned that we try to minimize deformation, but one way to deal with it could be to integrate some techniques used in garment design in general to reshape garments. So dart is a way to absorb curvature or to create curvature, while gathers and pleats can absorb excess of material. So those techniques were used in the reconfigurable garments papers I mentioned. I think they could be also adapted to our context. So I think the different papers have quite some complementary take on this problem. All right, so that brings me to the conclusion. So through those basically past 2 years, we explored this new problem of circular design or reuse. In all of those 3 projects, we faced some challenging optimization problem, mainly because of this mix of continuous and discrete variables. So we frame them often as assignment problems, but those are costly. One aspect that we didn't consider so much, except for the garments, is actually how do you cut those objects? For instance, if we look at wind turbine blades, different options exist. So on the far left, you see this gigantic circular saw that people use to cut them into large panels. Those mostly do planar cuts, while on the right, it's a portable water jet, which runs on a rail that you fix on the surface. I didn't study them in depth, but my intuition is that because you lay down those straight rails over the surface, you obtain geodesics. So I think that accounting for the limits of those manufacturing processes could be quite interesting as well. And so that brings me to what I think are the grand challenges in this domain. So one first challenge is to build the algorithmic foundations to represent and optimize cuts on the source and also assembly on the target, making sure that the panels connect well. Luckily, there's lots of work in geometry processing on those problems. So here I just show a few that I might use as inspiration, but yeah, the challenge is to find which ones adapt best to this new challenges that I highlighted. And similarly, making the search a bit more scalable because the assignment problems I've described are quite costly. So I didn't talk about machine learning so far, but that's maybe where it could be used. Here I show some recent work I've seen on object reassembly. So it's a scenario where an object has been fractured, and the goal is to find how those little pieces can be reassembled together. And this one was well solved by a diffusion process because we progressively move the pieces around until they match. And in this scenario, it's quite easy to generate training data because you take a final object, you fracture it, you move the pieces around, and you reverse the task. In our case, we don't know the pieces in advance. It's part of the challenge to discover where to cut. So that's why I don't see a way to directly apply this strategy. But ultimately, I think it would make sense to leverage machine learning to explore this search space, especially in the context where we know what type of shape we want to reuse. Let's say wind turbine blades. They all have roughly the same shape, even if they vary in size. So it's quite likely that a machine learning model could encode what shapes can be reached and what typical patterns need to be cut to achieve a target. So I don't have more concrete ideas, but I believe that it would be a solution to scale those problems. So that concludes my talk, I think, yeah. So thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm open to questions or discussions. Yes, John.
I wanted to ask about the cost of cutting seams because it seems like you consider it always more expensive, but sometimes cutting a seam can be beneficial since the existing seam damages the existing garment, and depending on the kind of seam, like the kind of knit, it might be easier to just like run a blade through and just immediately get rid of it. So I was wondering what nuance you had investigated there.
Yeah, so I think those cost inputs are more parameters that should be adjusted indeed to your practice or to the fabric you have and your experience. We just included them because in the books we read about garment reviews, they commented that deconstructing seams is very difficult. Making clean seams is also very difficult. So if you can avoid both of them by reusing the seam, you're gaining on both fronts. But maybe indeed, in some cases, just cutting and throwing it away is a good alternative. And in that case, you could just change those costs so that you actually try to use as few seams as possible if that's your objective.
Oh, thanks.
I had a question about the last project. The way the problem was framed seemed like your goal was to find, like which panel components from the source could be fit to the panels of the target. But assuming a given panel structure for the target seems to be perhaps overly restricted, that there might be a better way to fit panels from the source if you just consider the 3D shape of the target and don't prescribe some panel decomposition. I mean, I recognize that makes the optimization problem even less constrained and even harder.
Infinitely harder.
Yeah, but have you thought about this at all? Like,
Yeah. So yeah, we thought a lot about it because then it becomes much closer to the other
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
where you treat your garment as a 3D manifold and you try to optimize where to place the things. But yeah, then you're faced with a surface problem. While if you work with panels, you're in a flat domain. And yeah, it's a choice we made quite early in the project, but it enables everything else. But I agree that that could be definitely a good alternative. One aspect to consider then is also the aesthetic and the constraints of what shape those curves could take, because you cannot, I mean, sewing curved panels is very hard. You want your things to be as straight as possible, for instance. So yeah, all of those are very interesting questions. But I don't have a good answer. I think it's definitely a good thing to consider. Yes.
So in constructing new clothes from old, I mean, it's great because you're using less resources in making clothes, but the clothes you're making are different, right? I mean, I don't want to buy a tuxedo made this way. I don't want to buy a tuxedo at all, but that's a separate matter. Right. So you're sort of solving a different problem than the original one, which was to make clothing for people. This is to make clothing that has this kind of interesting recycled feel to it. At some point, doesn't that market become saturated? And so, and this is, I use the clothing as an example. The general question is, what do you do about the question of we're making different things than what we want to make new things, but what we're making is slightly different from the new things we said.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very broad question, and so I have several answers. So if I start with the very specific case of garments, when we started this project, we were inspired by all those tutorials that are really personal fabrication. People just they have one garment and they produce a different one, and they're happy they can reuse. But when I talked about these projects with colleagues at UDEF, I actually realized that they have had a master thesis on this specific topic in collaboration with a big garment retailer, which is called Zeeman, which is a Dutch garment retailer. And they asked the same question for the entire collection. They said, look, we have, let's say, summer 2024. We have all those garments that haven't been sold. Could we reuse them to design new garments? And then you're at a very different scale, because now you can do an entire collection with all the sizes people might want. And indeed, rather than trying to fit a garment to an individual, you fit an entire collection to a new collection with the same model of, well, consumers will choose the garment that best fits within that collection. So I think that's part of the answer. Depending on which scale we work on, this can become really beneficial. And so Zeeman was interested because not only they have incentive to not throw away their garments, but it's also good for them to reuse what they have rather than indeed buy new materials and restart again. The other answer to me is just, it's another constraint in the design process. When people manufacture, I don't know, furniture from flat pieces of wood, they are constrained to do flat stuff. Well, here it's the same, but instead of flat, it's curved in the way it's prescribed. But it's everyday design challenges to deal with the constraints to achieve your goal the best you can. And just realizing that this is indeed new types of constraints, and we need new design tools for that. But I don't see that as a reason to not pursue that direction, because design has always been about dealing with constraints. Thanks. Yes.
I was wondering if there is a sense of like, can we find the restitching of a piece of cloth that's like maximally like reduces the weight, the waste of it. Like for example, you showed like we saw a t-shirt and then we reuse everything and put it on like a puppy. Like, oh, this might be answered already somewhere, but like, is there a sense of like, can we choose the best target cloth like for the recycling so we get the most out of the original?
I see. So there are several questions here, I think. One which I didn't think about would be the opposite problem. If I have a source, what are the best target I should do, right? What are the targets that would best reuse that source? That's I think very interesting. It's more like a shape retrieval in a sense, like retrieve the targets that would be closest to this source. But even within a source target pair, trying to best approximate the target while reusing as much of the source is an interesting problem. One thing that our optimization includes is whether we use a panel at all. So in this example, you see that those blue and purple panels are not reused at all, meaning that they are kept untouched and they can be reused for another scenario. So it's an extra option we give to the user to say, either you say don't reuse this panel at all, or you just say, find the best reuse, but try to minimize the number of panels you cut. So those are several options you can consider.
Thank you.
All right, as we're at time, maybe we should thank our speaker one last time. All right.